Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the content patch for the 20th of March 2015. My name is TotalBiscuit with today's gaming news and comments. Coming up in the show, Atari is preventing the release of the spiritual successor to Tempest 2000. Nintendo has announced a new console, only they kind of haven't, and Jim Sterling receives DMCA from a rather aggressive indie developer. All this NeoC Remix track of the day is coming your way right about now. In something that's no doubt a disappointment to Tempest fans, the classic yet colourful wireframe arcade shooter, the spiritual successor to the title by the developer of Tempest 2000, which was itself a remake of Tempest from the 80s, has been denied release by Atari in a fairly lengthy legal letter outlining the reasons why this game should not be released on any platform. It was a letter sent by the Atari law firm Dorsey & Whitney LLP, which lays out what it seems as legally actionable similarities between TxK, which is the forthcoming spiritual successor, and Tempest, which is the original title, which was developed for Atari by David Thurer. The remake of the game, Tempest 2000, was created by Jeff Minter, who is a developer for Llamasoft, who is releasing TxK, or at this point, not releasing TxK. Atari is attempting to enforce trademark and intellectual property rights to prevent the release on multiple platforms. And of course, the developer is not particularly happy about that. He views this as very threatening, he views it as intellectual property bullying, and has expressed his fundamental disappointment at the behavior of Atari. Now, the letter itself is fairly detailed, and it outlines a wide variety of complaints. It starts by asserting that Tempest and Tempest 2000 are considered to be effectively legendary arcade games, although admittedly whoever spell-checked this particular legal dossier might want to reconsider their career options because they spelt it Tepmest in the first page, so congratulations to that. It then, after making these assertions, describes the TxK game as a blatant copy of the Tempest games, and also outlines a list of reasons as to why that is. It also points out the trademark link and passing off, which is a specific UK intellectual property law. To put it in layman's terms, it refers to the act of essentially deliberately deceiving the consumer to pass off your product as a product that belongs to another, which is assuming that the product is supposedly superior. It covers a wide variety of different things, and of course covers lawsuits involving things like the color of packaging and the construction of logos and things like that. Now, I've read the legal document to the best of my ability. I am out of touch with current UK IP law. I studied it approximately 10 years ago. But the complaints that they're making, and I know this is going to be a little bit upsetting to some of you, actually seem to be fairly valid. If this were another product, I would say that the amount of evidence that Atari is presenting on behalf of Tempest 2000's similarity to TxK is actually fairly compelling. They list a wide variety of both visual and gameplay elements. There are some questionable things in here, however. They claim that it features an electronic music soundtrack and sound effects which are indistinguishable from those used in Tempest 2000, which creates a similar atmosphere and environment familiar to players of the Tempest games. Now, that is flagrantly false, as anyone that's compared, say, a long play of Tempest 2000, which the Eurogamer article on the subject actually did, to TxK's alpha footage, and also knows that many of the tracks for TxK were composed by the members of a Tempest forum, and are actually original work inspired by the soundtrack of Tempest 2000. They are not the same. They sound similar in theme and style, absolutely. They are obviously meant to evoke memories of Tempest 2000, but they are clearly not the same, and they are absolutely distinguishable. So I don't really know what that argument is, but there are some fairly compelling arguments in here, including the idea that TxK copies a collection of terms and phrases that were coined by our client's predecessors, such as AI Droid, Particle Laser, Collect Power-Ups, Jump Enabled, Eat Electric Death, and Super Zapper Recharge. They also describe a wide variety of visual elements, the background being embellished with stars, blasts, and similar colorful elements in a forward movement, creating the illusion of a high-speed spaceship flight through the stars in a Star Wars style. The pointed aspects of the spaceship or claw as it runs along the rim of the playing field, always pointing to the center. They get very, very specific, even down to colors. The claw changes color as the game progresses, but its predominant color in Tempest 2000 and TxK is always yellow. These are the kind of things that you need to prove in order to make a successful intellectual property claim in the UK. This looks very similar to a lot of the stuff that I used to read at law school. And in most of these cases, a claim this detailed would probably win in court. So they do actually have a basis for this. However, the basis is on some very sketchy case law, which is quite out of date, and generally is, in my opinion, out of touch with the current landscape of computer games. Bear in mind, I am not a lawyer. I am just a law student, well, law graduate. I know a little bit about this, but only a little bit more than most. A lot of these particular cases, such as SAS Institute Incorporated, which is cited, and World Programming Limited, as well as Navitaire and EasyJet. These are the kind of things that you would have to stretch in order to make apply. So let me explain the basis of how case law works, right? Case law from a higher court in the UK is binding upon lower courts, meaning that unless a case is elevated much higher to, say, the High Court, the Court of Appeal, or the House of Lords, then what you have is a situation where a judge must abide by previous case law, but it's up to the lawyer to prove that the case law applies in this instance, and it's up to the defense lawyer to prove that the case law does not apply by differentiating the case suitably from the existing case. It's a fairly efficient way of getting things done, because what you have is a situation where judges can create what's called precedent, and that precedent then applies to cases that happen after the fact. And it's a way of speeding up the process, because it speeds up the decisions, it makes a lot of cases a lot faster and more efficient. So what the lawyer is attempting to prove here is that this precedent, I think his precedent is particularly weak, and I think that that might not stand up in court. But I think that the actual comparisons are legitimate, and it's obvious that TxK is in fact a very similar game to Tempest 2000. In fact, that has been admitted on multiple occasions by the actual developer himself. He was deliberately making a spiritual successor to Tempest 2000, which is a game he did make, but he made it for Atari, and it was also a remake of Tempest, which was not developed by him and was developed for Atari in the 80s. So this is a difficult situation. Here's the thing, though. In the current landscape, regardless of all of these fairly valid intellectual property comparisons and the similarities between the games, this is really not the sort of thing that seems to apply to video games all that much. There are very few cases of video games actually going to court over this stuff. There are cases of trademark scuffles. There are cases of threats. Very few of them actually go to court. There is very little intellectual property precedent that actually covers this, and as a direct result, we have rampant cloning and a lot of very similar games on, say, mobile devices in particular. In fact, there are clones of Tempest 2000 all over the place on mobile devices, and there's been no action taken against those specifically. So it feels very vindictive from Atari. It also feels unrealistic because, one, Atari has abandoned their trademark for Tempest 2000. It's a cancelled trademark. It was cancelled in 2006. So they don't maintain the trademark over Tempest 2000 anymore. They clearly didn't care enough to maintain it. Now, as much as they make the argument that Tempest 2000 is still being sold as part of Atari collections, they are clearly making absolutely no effort to make another Tempest game or attempting to push Tempest as a viable intellectual property in 2015. They are clearly not doing that. That is very, very demonstrable. Secondly, what the hell is the point? As demonstrated, this game is old. Tempest 2000 came out in the 90s, the original Tempest came out in the 80s. This is not a relevant IP anymore, and as many arguments as you can make about it being considered a classic, it frankly does not matter at this stage because it is not a big cash cow for you, and Atari isn't even making games. Atari is an irrelevant company, and from what I can tell, Atari is being used simply as an element to exploit old IP in copyright trolling cases. We've also got to the point where it's obvious that things like game mechanics cannot, in fact, be copyright. And many of the arguments made here, although they have, I note in the actual legal document, made a particular effort to avoid quite a lot of mechanical discussion, because I think they know, well, obviously they know that if they're a law firm with any competence, they know that game mechanics can't actually be trademarked. Although they have mentioned things like the jump method. They mention in the second example, for instance, in the legal document, the TxK adopts the gameplay, scoring methods, and rules of the Tempest games. For example, TxK adopts the jump feature from Tempest 2000, which allows players to press a button and jump their spaceship off the playing field and rain down shots on enemies below. That is not a valid argument in and of itself, but it is used to support the notion that these games are very similar. In fact, the majority of comparisons are actually made on visuals, which is a much easier argument to make if a game looks very similar. But again, this is a threat. This is a legal threat This is not, in fact, the reality of our industry right now. There are tons of clones of games. There are tons of games that use very similar visual styles on purpose to ape existing titles. And while some of it sucks, and obviously I'm against blatant cloning, especially when the clone becomes more popular than the original, the idea that you can borrow game mechanics and be inspired by different games is fundamental to the evolution of the industry. And it's very important that that be allowed to remain. I am worried that if a case like this goes to court and it ends up being a loss for the TxK developer, that it sets a precedent which makes it more difficult to create things like spiritual successors. Like, say, War for the Overworld, for instance. Obviously, it's based on Dungeon Keeper, but there are enough differences, in my opinion, to make it a game in and of its own right. And frankly, I want to see another Dungeon Keeper, and if EA is not willing to make one, then it's up to another company to come up with something similar. And I think that it's very consumer-focused, it's very consumer-friendly to allow an environment where that is possible, especially when you have a dead IP like Tempest, and there's obviously no intention whatsoever to create another Tempest game. And if it is, it's not going to come from Atari. I think there's blatant fault on both sides here. I think that actually Atari has a pretty damn good case, at least in terms of UK case law. It'll be interesting to see if they're able to actually apply that, or if they're willing to go to court over this. But frankly, I still view it as blatant copyright trolling. The fact of the matter is that a lot of the games industry is laissez-faire, live and let live, and that allows for vibrancy within our industry. If you don't have that, then I think you take away from the industry in a very big way. Atari basically has nothing to gain from this whatsoever. It seems petulant, it seems like a desperate grab of relevance, and even though I think that the developer has made some clear mistakes up to this point, especially admitting that the game is very, very similar to Tempest and deliberately saying, hey, you know, it is, and this was my work, and so on and so forth, even when he actually made the remake for Atari, and the original Tempest was not developed by him. I suppose you could call him the adoptive father of Tempest as opposed to anything else. I still side with him. You know, ultimately, this game not coming out is a net negative for the industry. And Atari is not benefiting the industry by copyright trolling like this, and they're protecting an IP that they clearly have not given two rats' asses about for 20 years. Nintendo has made an announcement of an announcement. They have claimed that they will be releasing a new console by the name of NX. It's their next generation hardware concept, and that we will know more about it next year. They also timed this with an announcement that they would be making mobile and PC games in partnership with a company by the name of Dana, which is actually pronounced DNA, but there you go. Interesting. This has, of course, been the subject of rampant speculation on game sites, and will be the subject of rampant speculation here because I'm a games pundit, and that's kind of what I do. It has spawned numerous interesting claims. For instance, we had an article in the week where it claimed that the announcement of the NX was an admission of failure on the part of the Wii U. Unfortunately, of course, that doesn't really hold much water because we don't know whether the NX is a handheld, we don't know whether the NX is a standard console, or indeed something else entirely, some completely different concept that they've come up with. So it seems unreasonable to suggest that it is an admission of failure, although it is entirely possible that it is. Because let's be frank, the Wii U has lost essentially all third-party support, and it seems like it's going to be very difficult to get third parties back on board unless a lot of money is paid to them. There are some developers that are willing to work as kind of pseudo-first-party studios with Nintendo, but simultaneously, it seems like a bit of a losing battle on the part of Nintendo to produce anything on that console that isn't their own work. And this is not the first time that Nintendo has had this problem. With handhelds, they've had quite a lot of success with third-party developers putting great games on it. But with their home consoles, there have been situations where that has not been true. I would say the GameCube and the N64 both suffered in this way. And later in the Wii's life, it also suffered, but not as much. On the core gaming side, it did. But you had plenty of shovelware and things like casual dancing games and party games and family games that were released by third parties on that system later in the system's life. The Wii U right now is a wasteland for third-party developers. You're getting indie devs and the occasional studio like, say, Platinum that has literally been paid by Nintendo to develop a game for them. And that is pretty much about it. If you look at the Wii U's launch lineup, if it's not a Nintendo-developed game, it's desolate, frankly. And all of the good games on that system, bar a few, are by Nintendo, or are very small indie titles, like Shantae and the Pirate's Curse, for instance. There seems to be a valid market on the Wii U, for ports at least, of existing indie titles. We get things like Shovel Knight, we get things like Chariot, Shantai, Spy Chameleon, for instance, which actually came out fairly recently and is not terrible. And then we get a bunch of terrible stuff like Frenchy Bird and Dolphin Up and all sorts of nonsense like that. But the Wii U is a difficult prospect, I think, for developers at the moment. That said, from a hardware point of view, Nintendo continues to develop games that run at 60 frames per second, look nice. Yes, they don't look like the Order 1886, but they're more interesting than the Order 1886. So they produce colorful, fun games in a graphic style and aesthetic that people actually enjoy. So you're getting a different audience there, and you get hardcore gamers on that machine with titles like Smash Brothers, you get hardcore gamers on there with Bayonetta 2, Wonderful 101, and of course things like forthcoming Splatoon and Xenoblade. The problem is that other than that, you're basically relying on the Wii U shop to provide you with new games for your system. The Wii U is a system that gets turned on like every few months, whereas as production ramps up on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, you're getting new games come out on those systems every few weeks that are actually worth playing. So that's where Nintendo slips in terms of the market share. They have difficulty getting enough good games on their system, which again goes right back to the GameCube comparison where they had exactly the same damn problem. It was not that they didn't have good games, they just didn't have enough of them coming out on a regular enough basis. And that's what ultimately sells consoles. A constant stream of killer apps, which is something that Nintendo can present, but they're pretty damn stretched to do so, and they're not hitting it every time. Yes, Smash Brothers is great, but something like Mario Party 10, well, it's a Mario Party game. You know, there's already been 10 of them. And they produce things like Mario vs. Donkey Kong, which is, you know, fairly average. They can't keep just churning things out. They can't get a Zelda game out every year. If they did, they probably suck. So you're waiting for those big killer apps, and then in the meantime, your Wii U just kind of sits there. Is it more likely to be a handheld replacement? Well, the 3DS seems to be going strong right now, and they've just updated it. They've just refreshed it. So I don't know if it's going to be a new handheld. I don't think that's really likely. It's perhaps more likely that they will create a new system, but that means the Wii U had a fairly short lifespan. That said, plenty of previous generation consoles have had similar lifespans to the Wii U. It's actually only in recent years that we've run into situations where consoles have had 7 to 8 year lifespans, like the 360 and the PlayStation 3. That is actually unusual. For instance, did you know that there was only a 4-year gap between the release of the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation and the Super Famicom Super Nintendo in Japan? And if you compared it to, say, the European release of the SNES in 1992, you had actually only a 3-year gap between those. And that's ridiculous when you think about it. The Super Nintendo into the Sony PlayStation within 3 years. That's insane. That's unheard of now. The Sega Dreamcast was released only 4 years after the Sega Saturn. Now, it was released in 1998. The Saturn came out in 94. The PlayStation 2 came out in 2000. The gaps were not as big as they are right now, whereas we had the Xbox 360 come out in 2005, and then the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One come out in 2014. That's a 9-year gap. That's actually huge. So it's entirely possible that we get a home console reset sooner than expected. It could be. It very well could be. What they would have to do with it, I don't know. I mean, they need more power. They need, obviously, more third-party support. And it really just comes down to third-party support more so than anything else, I think. So it'll be interesting to see what they come up with. Obviously, we don't know anything about it right now, so that was all pure speculation, and we'll know more next year. And finally, Jim Sterling has been hit with yet another DMCA claim. I like to cover this kind of thing because it's obviously very, very relevant to me as a YouTuber whenever I see this stuff. I've suffered false DMCA claims in the past, usually from petulant indie developers, and then, of course, once or twice from Sega, which resulted in a 2-year-plus boycott now, which is currently continuing, and I'm very happy to continue to boycott them until they bloody apologize. But regardless, this isn't about me, this is about Jim Sterling, and in this case, it was by a company called TxK, which has a game on Greenlight called Skateman Intense Rescue, the trailer for which was absolutely laughable and certainly worthy of mockery in his series Best of Steam Greenlight Trailers, which is essentially a riff session on bad trailers. It was fairly ridiculous. It's been taken down by TxK, and in fact, Kotaku actually went and contacted TxK, and TxK replied saying, "It is about time somebody stop that stupid guy. I seen all his video." Bear in mind, this guy's from Vietnam, so, you know, it's not particularly good English. "He is enjoying making money from Steam Greenlight and Greenlight videos from poor indie guys or new companies who have little to defend themselves. Almost all the Greenlight projects are still in development, and the developers are still working on it." I can't stand people that are using poor, weak developers for money, said the developer. Well, that sounds all noble and good, but I'm afraid when you put up a trailer for your game, that is essentially an advertisement for it. If you decide to put up a trailer for a greenlight game in the hopes that the game will get green-lit, you are asking for a space on Steam. You are asking for consumers to enable you to make money from your product. At that point, you become open to criticism. And that trailer was, frankly, ridiculous and very badly put together. It was recorded at a terrible frame rate and was deserving of mockery. The developer then went on to hypocritically claim that Jim Sterling was a bully. He said, he might be a king to you, but he is shit to me. You can always bully people, but one day you meet the wrong one. And please don't reply because we're not interested in your concerns. Well, unfortunately, as brave as this developer thinks he is, a DMCA claim is refutable, especially when it is false, and if you keep making them, you get into actual legal trouble. It's very unlikely this is ever going to go to court because, of course, it's in Vietnam, and Jim Sterling will get his video back. So ultimately, this is a petulant developer burning their own reputation for no reason and showing that they can't take criticism. And if you are selling a product to people and you are asking for money, you are open to criticism. It is that simple. If you don't want bad criticism, then might I strongly suggest that you don't put out bad trailers. Because your trailer's supposed to be the advertisement for your game. It's supposed to show the best bits. If those are the best bits, I don't want to see the worst. It's cowardice. This is a developer bullying a critic, not the other way around. And of course, that is always anti-consumer. You should never be in a situation where a developer, or indeed anyone else, can bully a critic into silence or censor their opinion. That is anti-consumer. You should be against that, and I will preach from the high heavens on that particular matter. You absolutely should be against that. And it doesn't matter what your opinion of the critic is entitled to his opinion and to express it. That's what freedom of speech actually means. And no, censorship is not just a government issue, you insufferably narrow-minded. Yeah, you get the idea. Alright, folks, that's me done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the content patch. Before I go, I'd like to give you the OC Remix track of the day. We're going to play another track from the absolutely phenomenal 7 Songs for 7th Saga. In fact, we're going to pretty much go through the entire album. This is, of course, cello arrangements by Sebastian Frege, and this particular track is called Water. You can download it in the description below this video, and I will see you next time.